In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Welcome, friends, to the 71st episode of Crime and Punishment, a legal podcast, not a political one. It is the official podcast of the Invictus Law Firm, PA, a criminal defense law firm in Orlando, Florida, the website for which is augustusinvictus.com, and that is me, yours truly, the host of this program. We are going to talk today about the FBI. I know it's a change of pace, this being a criminal defense program. We're going to talk about how the FBI sets people up, and for political reasons. We're going to talk about the political sabotage done by the FBI to both the left and the right wings. And we're going to do that by discussing this article from a magazine or from an outlet called Compact. Will the Left Stand Up to the Deep State? By Christian Parenti. Now, I'm not signed into YouTube apparently, so I can't share this to the chat. You're going to have to go to Emperor Invictus on Twitter. It's on my page. In fact, I have a lot of awesome articles on my page on Twitter. I post them every day. I post delicious little tidbits like this article here, but I promised last week that this would be the next episode of Crime and Punishment because it's an excellent article. It's written about how the left is all of a sudden just in love with the FBI, even after the FBI's long history of setting up leftists. So this is pointing out that hypocrisy. It's a pretty apolitical spin, I think, on the history of the FBI entrapping people, engaging in political sabotage. So let's just get on with it. The Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, the so-called New Church Committee, is being cast by Democrats and most of the mainstream media as a bat S-word crazy witch hunt. This is a family program after all. So let's start by talking about the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. This is a select subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee, created by the House on January 10th, 2023. So literally 2 months ago, they created this subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government. It was established to investigate alleged abuses of federal authority, including collision between federal agencies and private sector entities to suppress conservative viewpoints. They did what? Allegedly, of course. Allegedly. They cooperated with Facebook, with Twitter. Allegedly, they told Twitter executives to shut down so many of us who were on the right wing. Disclaimer, we're not right wing here at Crime and Punishment. We have no political viewpoint whatsoever. This is merely a legal podcast. We comment on legal news. Today we're commenting on something that happens to involve the political, but we ourselves have no political viewpoints whatsoever. We love Big Brother, we love whoever is in power at the moment, and we will go whichever way the wind blows. But the Twitter files did point out that the FBI was pressuring people and in extensive talks with people at Twitter to silence conservatives, to silence everybody on the right wing, during political elections, by the way. So, when they took the House, the Republicans made this subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government. And of course, the left wing is up in arms about it, calling it a tinfoil hat committee. So to go back to the article, the good news, however, is that the Democrats are not boycotting the committee, nor can any of them be kicked off of it by House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, the way Nancy Pelosi removed some Republicans from the January 6th investigation. How could she? This rule change was forced upon McCarthy by MAGA lawmakers, the so-called Freedom Caucus, who extracted concessions from him in 15 rounds of voting on his confirmation. Indeed, even the creation of the Subcommittee on Weaponization was a concession to these holdouts. So the MAGA Republican lawmakers forced McCarthy to create this subcommittee on weaponization, the weaponization of the federal government. Because apparently establishment Republicans are not convinced that the federal government, especially the FBI and DOJ, are wildly out of control. Democrats on the subcommittee, and progressives more broadly, should press to make the committee live up to and even surpass its namesake. The original eponymous church committee for its Senator Frank Church of Idaho documented widespread infiltration and sabotage of left-wing social movements by the FBI and other government agencies, including the CIA, which illegally targeted the domestic left in Operations Chaos, Merrimack, and Resistance. Now, it says they should press the committee to live up to its name. That's the article talking. That's Christian Parenti. That's not me, and that's not us at Crime and Punishment. That is the writer of the article. I just want to make very clear, we take no personal stance. We're just here to read the news. We're here to talk about the legal issues involved here. The Church Committee was triggered by the theft and release of a huge cache of FBI documents detailing its counterintelligence program, known by the clunky acronym COINTELPRO, which, of course, doesn't exist anymore, so the FBI would never engage in political sabotage now. Right? This whole idea that the FBI is shutting down conservative speech and blacklisting right-wingers and kicking them off of Twitter and arresting them on false charges. No. COINTELPRO is dead. They would never. But of course they would. And of course they have. As we've detailed forever on these programs. Beginning in 1956, this FBI campaign of surveillance, infiltration, disruption, and entrapment targeted first the Communist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party, then the Civil Rights Movement, and then the new left and left-leaning trade unions like the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America. Although most on the left have agreed that the new church committee with although most of the left have greeted the new church committee with hostility, recent news might change that. Days before the subcommittee's first hearing, news broke that the FBI had targeted the Denver area Black Lives Matter movement. A podcast called The Alphabet Boys obtained audio and video recordings of an FBI informant and provocateur who infiltrated the group during the nationwide unrest following George Floyd's murder. In 2020, Mickey Windecker showed up in Denver smoking cigars, driving a hearse loaded with guns, and talking ultra-radical claptrap about having served with Marxist Kurdish guerrillas in Syria. What an outlandish personality. Amazing. Totally not a glow-in-the-dark Fed here. When you show up smoking cigars in a hearse loaded with guns and talking about how you served with Marxist Kurdish guerrillas in Syria, no red flags there whatsoever. Despite his preposterous persona, Windecker managed to entrap one BLM activist into pleading guilty on weapons charges. He also worked to inflame peaceful demonstrations by, quote, encouraging people to break windows and leading marches directly into police traps, end quote. How many times has that happened? On the left wing and the right wing. Right? But, come on. More on the right wing. I think it's pretty clear. At least in recent years. I don't know if you guys remember, but there were all those marches in Portland in 2017, 2018. The Proud Boys, the Antifa, just going at it for months and months. Like 2 years without stop, right? And there was this one video clip of this tall black dude with dreads marching around and screaming with the Antifa, screaming at the Proud Boys, just egging people on, trying to get people in fights, right? Trying to fight with the Proud Boys, like physically aggressive. And then you see him when one of the Antifa goes out in the street and I forget what he does. I think he put a sign in front of a car or something to block traffic. And that black dude with dreads reached out, grabbed him, and threw him to police. I mean, amazing. And then just went right back to being a provocateur. I remember that video. It was very vivid. Anyway, encouraging people to break windows and leading marches directly into police traps. That happened in another case. One that I was contacted on, actually, out in California. And they had deliberately set up the white nationalists out there to walk into Antifa. They deliberately caused the confrontation, which is exactly what happened in Charlottesville. They deliberately made it so that the Antifa and the white nationalists would run into each other. So this is nothing new in this article. Nothing new to you anyway, dear listener. You know all this. Preaching to the choir here. Windecker and his FBI handlers even attempted to recruit BLM activists into an assassination plot against Colorado Attorney General Phil Weiser. How about that? So it's not just the FBI agents setting up right-wingers in Michigan to kidnap and assassinate governors. They're also setting up BLM activists in Colorado to kidnap the Attorney General and assassinate him. Ultimately unsuccessful, this scheme shows the outrageous lengths to which a bureau will go to manufacture threats. It is reasonable to assume this was not the only recent FBI infiltration of the left political movement. If you haven't seen the movie Imperium, I strongly recommend it. If only because the opening of the movie shows what the FBI does, right? Like the author says here, they manufacture threats. They recruit these people. They give them the ideas. They give them the supplies, the resources necessary. They give them the weapons or the bombs, whatever the case may be. And then they set them up. They entrap them into this, and then they bring down the hammer. They force them to take a plea. Obviously, nobody's going to trial on that. And then they tout to the entire country how they prevented a terrorist attack. The opening of Imperium actually shows that, I think, pretty well. And it shows the crisis of conscience that Harry Potter has, having been the FBI agent on the case. And then, of course, he's moved into the white nationalist scene, where he's, trying desperately to find these terrorists, etc. But, of course, they really are terrorists, the white people, not the black immigrant Muslim that was set up in the beginning, which does happen. That does happen. It's not just some Hollywood trope that, these, the Muslims are set up by the FBI while the white nationalists are actually the real terrorists. No, the FBI does set up both sides of the fence. 100% accurate. Very accurate for a Hollywood movie. The Bureau has a history of targeting figures and groups it sees as real political threats. Dr. Martin Luther King, for example. But it also has a well-documented history of fabricating political enemies where none exist. Throughout its history, the FBI has used both real and concocted threats to expand its budgets, powers, and prerogatives. Yes, every level of government does the same exact thing. The FBI are just the masters of it. We won't go down that tangent there. During the War on Terror, that is the FBI, subjected American Muslims to a multi-billion-dollar campaign of infiltration and frame-ups. A 2013 study found that more than half of all post-9/11 terrorism prosecutions involved FBI entrapment using paid informants who bamboozled often young, socially marginalized Muslims into fake plots. Some of these traps even targeted people with documented intellectual disabilities. In 2017, a 16-year veteran of the Bureau named Terry Albury exposed these abuses and was rewarded for his honesty with 4 years in federal prison. Just swap out all these words. Let's say a 2023 study found that more than half of all post-Charlottesville terrorism prosecutions involved FBI entrapments using paid informants who bamboozled often young, socially marginalized white nationalists into fake plots. Some of these traps even targeted people with documented intellectual disabilities. In 2023, a 16-year veteran of the Bureau named whoever it's going to be exposed these abuses and was rewarded for his honesty with 4 years in federal prison. The thing is, they sold us the Patriot Act, and I was a kid when this happened. I was a teenager. I was 18 when 9/11 happened. Patriot Act followed right on the heels. I was a kid. Patriot Act was sold to all of us because it was going to stop Muslim terrorism, which of course at that time was the biggest threat to America. Now we all know white nationalism is the greatest threat to America. Patriots, anti-government white people, those are the biggest threat that we face today. Bigger than ISIS, says the DOJ. It was sold to us in that manner. We're going to stop Muslim terrorism by checking all of your library records, by checking all of your bank accounts. You got to require ID for X, Y, and Z, no wire transfers under these terms. All that. Also, by the way, we're going to dramatically increase these draconian sentencing requirements in federal court. And then they immediately used it against white nationalists, white supremacists, anti-government people, right? Most notably Matthew Hale. Doubled his sentence. Refused to take a plea, went to trial, doubled his sentence, used the Patriot Act to put that man in prison for 40 years. Immediately used the Patriot Act against Americans, not against Muslim terrorists. So to think that this is some new thing that the FBI is doing because, white supremacists are evil and, the worst threat in the world to global security, etc., etc. They've been doing this since the beginning of the FBI. This goes back all the way to the days of the bank gangsters, right? John Dillinger. When the FBI used Dillinger and other bank robbers to expand its influence to say, look, the G-men are taking care of these gangsters that are, destroying America, and it's so on and so forth. That is how Hoover expanded the FBI's power, its budget, and it's exactly what this article is pointing out, except that they're talking about politics. The FBI's history in COINTELPRO, the FBI's history in sabotaging Muslims and trapping Muslims into committing these fake crimes. And now, the guy is pointing out, you leftists really don't think that the FBI is doing this to right-wingers? You think this whole thing is a conspiracy theory? You're out of your minds. Despite the FBI's history of wanton abuse, many of my left-wing friends refuse to consider evidence of federal infiltration of MAGA-aligned organizations. My friends, that's Christian Parenti's friends, not mine, my friends, alas, engage in historically inaccurate deductive reasoning. The FBI is right-wing, they assume. Therefore, it would never move against right-wing groups. But it has, and it does. The historical record is clear. While the vast majority of the FBI's subversion campaigns have targeted the left, the FBI has also moved against apolitical and culturally conservative groups. Indeed, many persecuted Muslim American organizations fit that description. It has also spied on and harassed and built compromising dossiers on mainstream politicians. And despite having many agents with right-wing politics, the Bureau has kept tabs on, infiltrated, and occasionally repressed neo-Nazis and the Klan. One thing I didn't do is I didn't check the chat here to make sure the audio is working, but it looks like it is. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Brian. Afternoon, Top Short. David Cunningham, a scholar of the security state, has argued that the FBI's approach during the 1960s focused on controlling the Klan's activities, whereas the Bureau's campaign against left radicals focused on eliminating the new left's ability to act and spread its ideas. William Keller, author of The Liberals and J. Edgar Hoover, Rise and Fall of a Domestic Intelligence State, argues that the FBI's few counterintelligence programs against various factions of the KKK during the early 1960s, while provoked by real Klan violence done at the urging of liberals and never particularly aggressive, were then used by the Bureau to build liberal consent for bigger budgets, as well as more insularity, secrecy, and autonomy. Keller argues that it was precisely the bureaucratic gains made fighting the Klan that a few years later allowed the FBI such tremendous latitude in its extremely violent repression of the Black Panther Party and other new left groups. As Keller puts it, liberals delegated extensive, concentrated, and unknown powers to the Agency of Internal Security, hiding them away within the FBI as if they did not exist. This is the dark side of the moon, where liberalism confronts an authoritarian adversary using authoritarian tactics as a means of dispatching it. In so doing, liberals risk the creation of a second threat, a state within a state, which would not be bound by the constraints of the constitutional order. In other words, the FBI's targeting of the Klan back in the 60s caused liberals to say, oh, great, well, the FBI is doing good work here. We should consent to their exponential growth. We should consent to this outrageous budget provided to the FBI. Because after all, they're going after the Klan. Is that not exactly what's going on? Well, of course, they're going after the alt-right. They're going after white supremacists, white nationalists, terrorists. We should give them all the power in the world. They should stop at nothing to root out these evil white supremacists. It's like it's the playbook that has been in use for thousands and thousands of years, and people just keep falling for it. You make this scapegoat group. You provide the government with just untold tyrannical power to do whatever they want. They have a blank check. And then, as if by magic, they use that power on everybody. No, that's never happened before in history. The FBI wouldn't do that. They're all good folks, and they're going after the ultimate evil, the white supremacists. But this author is arguing that that's already been the case. You've already done this. This is how the FBI has so much power right now. You keep falling for it, and will my friends on the left ever stand up to this deep state? Stand up to this state within a state that is completely unregulated and uncontrolled. By the 1980s, the New Left had been largely repressed and co-opted out of existence, but the FBI did not end its secret domestic counterinsurgency. When labor organizations, nonprofits, and church groups started organizing to stop the U.S. proxy wars in Central America, the Bureau started monitoring, infiltrating, and disrupting them. Amazing. The 1990s saw the FBI increase its focus on the far right. And this campaign, perhaps paradoxically, caused the far right to grow. Federal law enforcement's deadly overreach at Ruby Ridge and then at Waco, against the weird but apolitical Branch Davidian cult, spurred on growth of the militia movement that culminated in Timothy McVeigh's 1995 bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. 6 years later came 9/11 and the USA Patriot Act, which swept away the few remaining reforms imposed on federal intelligence agencies after the Church Committee. Flush with ever more funding, power, and secrecy, the FBI built a gigantic stable of paid informants and freelance snitches. Trevor Aronson, author of The Terror Factory, has described it as, quote, the largest network of spies ever to exist in the United States, end quote. I mean, it's all over pop culture, right? The way that the FBI uses informants, the way the FBI pays people, and they are spies. That is what they are. So this is a spy network that our government has created against its own people. It's not often put like that. It's usually, the heroic anti-hero FBI agent is calling on his contacts in the streets, or the local cop or whoever it is calling on these contacts that are all scumbags, of course, and they beat them up to get this information out of them. But that's okay because we know that they're the good guy. They're just misunderstood. And all these informants, by the way, are scumbags who have criminal cases hanging over their heads because they're scumbags. You see that archetype played out over and over and over again in the movies. In reality, this is a spy network, plain and simple. The FBI pays people cash for information on other American citizens. What else do you call that? It is a spy network. These people, your fellow citizens, are assets and informants. As I've made the case so often, everything we accused the KGB of doing, the FBI does do right now, while we are speaking. The Church Committee found that the FBI retained about 1,500 informants. By 2015, FBI records revealed in court cases showed that number had reached to 15,000. That was 8 years ago. The FBI had 15,000 informants. How many do you think there are now? Post-Charlottesville, right? In the Biden administration, post-Trump. How many informants do you think are on the FBI payroll now? Meanwhile, various whistleblowers and other sources suggest there may be 3 times as many informal part-time informants working off the books. So those are 15,000 documented informants in 2015. They're suggesting that there are actually, 45,000 off the books, so 60,000 total. And again, that's 2015. You can't imagine how many informants and assets are in the FBI's spy network right now. And as we pointed out in, I think it was the last program, on infiltration by the FBI of the Latin Mass community in the Catholic Church, think about that. The FBI is expanding its spy network into your parish. And how are they doing it? By saying that Latin Mass Catholics implicitly share ground with white supremacists. To continue with the article, with the election of Donald Trump, it seems, the FBI started targeting some of his far-right base. And in 2020, the Department of Homeland Security declared homegrown right-wing terrorism its #1 domestic threat. A glaring example of FBI entrapment against the right is the plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. The would-be kidnappers, a group of broke, socially outcast fantasists calling themselves the Wolverines, were infiltrated by at least a dozen FBI confidential informants working closely with a bevy of agents who kept the plotters under nearly constant surveillance. The FBI, far from trying to stop the plot, seems to have encouraged it. Similar can be said for the January 6th riot. Both the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, 2 groups crucial in planning January 6th, were heavily infiltrated by the FBI. Even the Proud Boys' national chairman, Enrique Tarrio, had worked as an undercover FBI informant on numerous cases prior to joining the far-right group. By his own admission to Reuters, Tarrio routinely let police departments know the Proud Boys' plans. No comment. A Capitol Police Intelligence Unit reported up the chain of command 2 weeks prior to the riot. See, even the author, Parenti, is calling this a riot. So he's not some right-wing lunatic, right? He's not a MAGA guy. A Capitol Police Intelligence Unit reported up the chain of command 2 weeks prior to the riot that some of the protesters planned to be armed, were bent on violence, and intended to target Congress. Despite all this intelligence, the Capitol was left largely unprotected. As the House January 6th Committee's chief investigative counsel, Tim Heffy, explained in an exclusive NBC interview, there was no intelligence failure, but rather a failure to act on intelligence. Suspiciously, this conclusion was not presented in the committee's televised hearings nor final report. A couple surprising things. Number one, that this is the same person who was hired by Charlottesville, the city of Charlottesville, to determine who was at fault for the quote-unquote riots in 2017. And Tim Heffy said, actually, it was your fault. It was your fault, city of Charlottesville. It was your fault, Charlottesville Police Department. You literally set this thing up. You did everything you could to cause a riot. Nobody talks about the Heffy report. The second amazing thing about this is that the House January 6th Committee hired Heffy, even after he wrote that report saying, actually, it was your fault, city of Charlottesville. The man is out of control. He's a loose cannon. He's actually blaming the people who need to be blamed. And here he is saying, in an NBC interview, there was no intelligence failure. There was a failure to act on the intelligence. They knew what was happening. They knew that this crowd was coming. They knew all these things, and nobody acted on it. Like they were setting it up. Kind of like Charlottesville. Characters like Ray Epps, the ex-military rancher filmed urging protesters to invade the Capitol, who also bragged in a text message to his nephew that he orchestrated the invasion, have been largely ignored by the FBI. Just after the riot, Epps landed on the FBI's most wanted list, but then his name was quickly dropped and he was never even interviewed by the FBI, even as the Bureau has hounded plenty of January 6th attendees who never got past the edge of the crowd. That is the understatement of the century right there, Mr. Parenti. Hounded plenty of January 6th attendees. It's the largest manhunt definitely in American history, possibly world history. Largest prosecution in United States history. They've talked to everybody who was there, and they've charged hundreds of people. Whether we regard the riot as a dangerous conspiracy to overturn the election or a justified protest that got out of control, we should take into account mounting circumstantial evidence of FBI infiltration, incitement, and entrapment. Yet my radical and progressive comrades more often wave away the growing list of peculiar and difficult facts with vague suppositions about bumbling bureaucratic screw-ups. A different conclusion strikes me as inescapable. That is, Parenti, not yours truly. A different conclusion strikes me as inescapable. The American security state is totally out of control. It makes war on anyone, left, right, center, apolitical, religious, whom it regards as threatening. Even parents who spoke out against COVID closures and woke curricula at school board meetings have been investigated. Looming at the edges of this story is a specter of controlled opposition. That is, oppositional social movements that are so thoroughly penetrated by the intelligence services as to be controlled by the state. During the exposés of the 1970s that led to the formation of the Church Committee, at least one FBI informant described controlled opposition as an explicit Bureau goal. In 1975, Joseph A. Burton told the New York Times in a series of interviews about his work as an FBI informant penetrating and disrupting Marxist-Leninist groups in the United States and Canada. Instructed by the Bureau to, quote, do anything to prevent Marxist-Leninists from coming together, end quote, Burton even created a Maoist organization called Red Star Cadre. Burton also infiltrated a Tampa local of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees because it was trying to unionize garbage collectors. He did the same to the United Electrical Workers Union that was organizing at a Westinghouse plant. He sabotaged Vietnam veterans against the war, organized various protests, helped distribute left-wing literature, liaised with radical groups in Canada, and much more. As Burton explained, the Bureau's aim was to control the radical left. The hope was that we could control demonstrations, the hope was, quote, that we could control demonstrations, make them move when we wanted them to, make them shout when we wanted them to, end quote. Unaccountable domestic intelligence forces threaten more than controlled opposition. The possibility of managed democracy, to use an epithet typically flung at states like Russia, isn't unthinkable. How far away are we from the hollowing out of our most important political processes, like elections, because they are secretly manipulated by the domestic intelligence services? Whoa. We are not making that claim. I want to make very clear. YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, wherever else we're broadcasting this, we're not making that claim. We at Crime and Punishment would never say that domestic intelligence services are throwing elections. That's him. We have no position on that. Do not ban us. If this sounds impossible or far-fetched, says Parenti, consider the Hunter Biden laptop saga. As someone who has been pleasantly surprised by some of President Biden's policies, it pains me to say this, but the laptop clearly documents very serious corruption. Worse yet, the FBI put its thumb on the scale during the presidential election of 2020, first by refusing to release the contents of the laptop, then by encouraging censorship of the laptop story when it told social media providers the story was Russian disinformation. That was in the Twitter files, by the way. If you haven't read the Twitter files, what are you waiting for? You have got to read the Twitter files. Biggest bomb dropped in the last decade. The domestic intelligence state needs to be reformed and radically pruned, if not totally dismantled and replaced with accountable institutions. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reform these rogue entities. That will only happen if there is cooperation from the left. The House Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government plans to propose legislation. Without left-wing participation and pressure, it is hard to imagine that the Republicans on the committee will really move against the FBI on their own. to be young again. So what Parenti seems to miss is that the left has no intention, no desire, no incentive to cooperate for the good of the country, to do something collaborative with Republicans because, the FBI might move against some of our people. Who cares? That's the difference here. The left is playing realpolitik. The right is playing some Mr. Rogers, can't we all get along garbage. Right? The left clearly understands what is going on. They understand that this FBI thing is like a golem that maybe they can't control, but probably they can. And historically, it looks like things are going in their direction. And the right wing's plan is what? To say, look, guys, can't we all get along? Pretty please, just support us on this subcommittee of the weaponization of the federal government so that the FBI doesn't turn on you too. Because the FBI is over there saying, yeah, okay, so they set up, one Black Lives Matter activist in Colorado? Oh no, they're really coming after us. But look at everything they're doing to the right wing, to the MAGA Republicans, to the white supremacists. So yeah, maybe the FBI bites us every now and then, some random activist in Colorado or whatever. But clearly the FBI is on our side, so why in God's name would we support legislation from these MAGA Republicans restricting the dog that's out there biting all of our enemies? So, while it is a great article, in terms of exposition, a history lesson, imploring the left to join up forces, based on some moral imperative. Like, come on, man. Come on. Where have you been the last several years? After all, he continues, this is not just a matter of ideology. Since the earliest days of J. Edgar Hoover's leadership, the Bureau has made a point of developing compromising dossiers on members of the political class. The chair of the subcommittee, Jim Jordan, is alleged to have turned a blind eye to the sexual abuse of teenage athletes back when he was a high school wrestling coach. No doubt Jordan worries how that part of his past might be, shall we say, weaponized against him during a future election. Leftists are badly deluded if they think an unaccountable secret police state will attack only neo-Nazis. The stronger the security state, the more enemies it will find or manufacture, and the more pressure it will apply. Under such conditions, any left that can wage a meaningful class struggle will be crushed. If leftists, particularly Marxists and socialists, have an interest in democratic political agitation unmolested by secret police, they should not dismiss the undeniable fact of the FBI using counterintelligence tactics against far-right groups and MAGA supporters. A principled and pragmatic left position is simply this. COINTELPRO's style entrapment and provocation are wrong when done to the left and wrong when done to the right. Oh, bravo, good chap. But you are talking to a wall. I just think you have completely missed the minds of the people you're trying to reach. Marxists and socialists are not going to team up with conservatives and the far right and MAGA Republicans just because there's some vague threat in the future that the FBI is going to turn on them. Marxists, you know what? I would recommend to everyone here. It's on the Marine Corps reading list for officers. Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy. Just get the audiobook because it's pretty wordy. I think it's great narration if you get it on Audible. But he talks about the differences in style and personality and foreign policy between Hitler and Stalin, right? And one of the things he points out is that Marxists, specifically Stalin, who is a very rigid Marxist when it came to communist theory, they believe in history. And they believe that history is inevitable. They are scientists, right? Basically scientists in lab coats, and they're trying to just hurry this historical process along. They don't care that the FBI could vaguely turn on them in the future at some point if they run out of Nazis to dream up. The FBI is doing their bidding. It's just plain foolish to appeal to the Marxists on an emotional, can't we all get along level. This is why the right wing loses. That's just one of many reasons. Not that I care. I don't have any political opinions. I have zero political views. None of us do here at Crime and Punishment. Just pointing out the absurdity of using arguments like this. But great article when it comes to pointing out that the FBI attacks whoever they want, right? So we will end there today. I just wanted to read this one article. We will come back next week. Actually, you know what? Next week, I want to talk about the Family Legal Guide. I beat up on the American Bar Association a lot because they're, just awful. However, they put out this Family Legal Guide, I think several years ago. They started in 1990. This particular copy is from 2004, the third edition. But it has all these subjects in here, and it has an entire chapter on criminal justice. And I want to read through that. I think it would be great for tutorial purposes, educational purposes. It is a pretty good summary of how the judicial process works in criminal cases. So I think we're going to talk about that next week. Totally apolitical. Just talk about the law, the criminal justice system. Oxymoron, right? But that's what we'll come back with next week. So until then, everybody, I hope you all stay in school. Don't do activism. And, raise your families and get to the gym. Till next week.